Watching, rewatching, researching, and writing about these films has taken a bit of a toll on me. As much as I try to put it away from mind as a way of reaching in and taking hold. The films I talk about in this video are all immensely affecting, and I certainly wouldn't recommend watching them back to back as I did. But I would absolutely recommend watching them eventually, if you haven't already. They may be difficult to stomach, but each has universal images of great power and resonance, and are each masterpieces in their own right. They each portray in grotesque visuals what violence inflicts on individuals, families, cities, and countries. We see the carnage inflicted on an island nation by a war which for them really began with Pearl Harbor and ended with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. War is a preeminent motif throughout art, literature, and film. Past, present, and future, violence has and will continue to etch into the minds of everything and everyone it touches. Its visceral and grim reality comes down to life and death. It's no surprise that Japanese authors told their story and their struggle through their medium. It was only a matter of time. I want to explore but a small fragment of Japanese cinema, in particular animation, which has explored these themes of war, and to find perhaps some beauty in an aesthesis of fire. Barefoot Gen and Grave of the Fireflies both heavily explore the tragedy inherent in war, and particularly the tragic plight of the Japanese people through World War II. Notably, the events which have been told and retold through films such as Godzilla, Rhapsody in August, Black Rain, and countless others, are so preeminently displayed because of the singularity and atrocity of US retaliation, which has burned itself into the Japanese psyche. The people of Japan, the only country to have ever been bombed with nuclear explosives, must have, in the aftermath, felt every ounce of that cruelty and violence which war brings. And such strong emotions are inevitably catalysts for self-expression, and countless writers, painters, poets, and filmmakers generated a wealth of art in the aftermath of such a tumultuous period of Japanese history. Barefoot Gen and Grave of the Fireflies mirror each other greatly. In a way, they're sister films, considering the same themes and both tracing their roots from wartime experiences. Nakazawa and Nosaka were both drawing from their memories of the war and are prime examples of Japanese art produced post-war. Whether you are familiar with these films or not, they tell stories as old as time. And the horrors they display, as heart-wrenching as they are, simulate war through its death and carnage, and display so aptly its way of releasing the monster in humanity, as it has so consistently throughout history. Japanese imperialism was born not only from a small island nation's greed and lust for power and territory, but also a need for resources. Resources such as oil and coal to power their war machines, as well as things like rubber, tin, copper, and iron to make steel for their war and industrial complex. Most of these resources were imported from the United States and other countries. This need for resources led Japan to invade Manchuria and northern China. This would be the period where such atrocities as the Nanjing Massacre would take place. The Japanese Navy would also enter French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies, what is now modern-day Indonesia. The US would see this expansion of Japanese territory as aggression, which threatened their own interests in the Pacific. The expansion, as well as Japan's newfound alignment with Nazi Germany and Italy, firmly planted them as the bad guys in the eyes of most Americans. In retaliation, America decided to embargo iron, steel, and copper to Japan, a fairly significant blow, but Japan still didn't budge. The US would then freeze Japanese assets in America so they couldn't buy oil, another huge blow, because the US was a primary supplier of their oil. This freeze led to diplomatic talks between the two nations. The US wanted the complete withdrawal of Japan from French Indochina and the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. Japan considers this total defeat and refuses. The Japanese plan becomes further extension into the Pacific against US allies, and now fearing military retaliation from the US, would adopt a strategic attack by one Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The plan is to blunt US impact in the Pacific by targeting a critical naval base on one of the Hawaiian Islands, Pearl Harbor. It's hard to say exactly who in the Japanese government at the time was calling all the shots. Although the emperor was held in high esteem, there have been many questions surrounding his actual political power. The Japanese army and navy held a large amount of power, and thus their leaders held a lot of sway in the government. But the thing is, if the emperor wanted to, he could have, at any time, said, "This war is over." That is within the domain of power granted to him as emperor, divinely ordained in the social hierarchy by God, and elevated to godlike status within society. The Japanese government during World War II was a very strange amalgamation, described as a form of mixed constitutional absolute monarchy, meaning that most of the time the emperor disregarded matters of policy and state. He essentially kept his hands out of the kitchen and let the other political leaders do their thing. This ethos of restraint was a self-imposed limit to the emperor's power. But if he wanted to, there was nothing actually stopping him from doing what he wanted as an absolute monarch. The influence of Emperor Hirohito on decision-making, however, is debated. Many say that Hirohito took little action during the war, and it was mostly the ultra-nationalist military leaders of the army and navy in power. But we have no real solid proof of that. And who knows if Hirohito's wartime past was in a way laundered to give the appearance of an emperor not complicit in the militaristic atrocities of wartime Japan. The Japanese experience during wartime was one of extreme hardship. Through food rationing, strict government control of goods, intense propaganda, and a pervasive sense of militaristic duty, the role of Bushido has a part to play in all this. The warrior way, the ethos of honor of the samurai, formalized during the Tokugawa shogunate, was reawakening within the Japanese soul. And this was no coincidence. The revival of Bushido through propaganda gave the Japanese government a military force which the world hadn't seen since the ancient days of the samurai. An intensity of mind and character rivaled by no other great power at the time. This almost fanatical dedication led to things like kamikaze pilots and high rates of seppuku, ritual suicide, which you saw virtually nowhere else in any other great power to this extent. There's also stories of people like Hiro Onoda, who was found still fighting on Lubang Island in the Philippines in 1974, 29 years after the end of the war. Can you imagine that? He survived on wild fruits, game, and stolen rice, and continued to have shootouts with the locals. And he wouldn't stop. He wouldn't believe anyone and thought the flyers and newspapers given to him were propaganda. In the end, the Japanese government had to fly out his family and his military commander from the war to literally order him to surrender. If that's not dedication, I don't know what is. This is the time Japanese were living in. A wartime government that was fighting, as the famous line goes, to the last man, woman, and child. Another famous line promoting unwavering resistance to the Allied powers, which really accentuates the point. The sooner the Americans come, the better. 100 million die proudly. Barefoot Gen, directed by Mori Masaki and based on Keiji Nakazawa's seminal manga, depicts the atomic bombing of Hiroshima during World War II and its devastating aftermath. Some may consider it dated in its animation, but the enormity of the emotions on display are as impactful as the day it was created. The film, while fictional in its narrative, is still semi-autobiographical, reflecting Nakazawa's personal experiences as a survivor of the Hiroshima bombing. Through its protagonist, Gen Nakoaka, the story presents a poignant account of survival, loss, and resilience that parallels Nakazawa's own life. Keiji Nakazawa was 6 years old when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The bombing killed his father, brother, and sister. They were caught under the debris of their house as a result of the explosion. Only his mother and infant sister survived. But several weeks later, his infant sister also succumbed to either malnutrition or radiation from her mother. These traumatic events are echoed in Barefoot Gen, as the film vividly portrays the bombing's physical and emotional devastation. Gen's journey mirrors Nakazawa's, capturing the indiscriminate destruction of war and the enduring struggles of survivors. The depiction of Gen's family, particularly the bond between Gen and his mother, echoes Nakazawa's memories of his own relationship with his mother, who played a crucial role in their survival amid the ruins of Hiroshima. The autobiographical nature of the film is most apparent in its unflinching depiction of the horrors of the bombing. Scenes of civilians engulfed in flames, bodies reduced to ash, and survivors wandering in shock reflect Nakazawa's first-hand observations. These details serve not only to document history, but also to honor the victims and raise awareness about the human cost of nuclear warfare. In addition to its biographical elements, Barefoot Gen explores broader themes that transcend Nakazawa's individual story. The film examines the resilience of the human spirit, as Gen and his family struggle to rebuild their lives amidst unimaginable adversity. It also critiques the militarism and nationalism that led Japan into the war in the first place, highlighting the suffering inflicted on ordinary citizens. In this one wonderful scene, Gen asks his father if they'll ever have enough to eat, and Gen's father replies, "Yes, when the war is over." These themes, while rooted in a specific historical context, resonate universally, emphasizing the need for peace and empathy in the face of conflict. Barefoot Gen is not merely a historical account, but also a deeply personal narrative shaped by Keiji Nakazawa's own experiences. Its autobiographical nature lends it a profound emotional weight, transforming it into a powerful testament to the resilience of survivors and a sobering reminder of the catastrophic consequences of war, ensuring that the memories of Hiroshima's victims live on, urging future generations to strive for a world free of nuclear devastation. Grave of the Fireflies, directed by Isao Takahata, was a film I could barely stomach. Its story captures the devastating impact of World War II on civilian life in Japan, and was adapted from Akiyuki Nosaka's semi-autobiographical short story of the same name, which I read several years ago, in a wonderful translation by James R. Abrams. It follows the same narrative, and is just as affecting as the film. The film tells the story of two siblings, Seita and Setsuko, as they struggle to survive amidst the ruins of war. The film's deeply personal roots, combined with its universal themes of familial love, resilience, and the tragic cost of war, make it a timeless masterpiece. The autobiographical nature of Grave of the Fireflies is similar to that of Barefoot Gen, and stems from Nosaka's own experiences during the war. Like Seita, Nosaka lost his sister to malnutrition, and the guilt of failing to save her heavily influenced the story. The portrayal of Seita and Setsuko's bond is both tender and heart-wrenching, emphasizing the enduring strength of familial love even in the face of despair. The siblings' descent into poverty and isolation mirrors the plight of countless civilians during wartime, highlighting especially the vulnerability of children in times of conflict. Loss and the innocence of childhood permeate the film. Setsuko's childlike wonder and moments of joy provide a stark contrast to the grim reality of their circumstances, underscoring the tragedy of lives cut short by war. The film also critiques societal apathy, as the siblings face indifference from neighbors and relatives, reflecting the breakdown of community ties during periods of extreme hardship. Ultimately, Grave of the Fireflies is a powerful anti-war statement, illustrating the human suffering that extends far beyond the battlefield. On full display, of course, is the constant duality of cruelty. One nation commits a terrible act, then another acts viciously in retaliation. The constant cyclic nature of violence. This is no surprise. In fact, I would argue it's intrinsic to human nature, etched into the codes of Hammurabi. An eye for an eye. In many ways, Seita and Setsuko's story is similar to that of Romeo and Juliet, a romantic tragedy. Even Nosaka himself said, "In the end, it turns out that the days leading up to their death are like the development of a love story." Their relationship was not that of lovers, but a different kind of love. They couldn't live without each other. After the death of their mother, Setsuko needed Seita to protect her and feed her, and Seita needed her for companionship, a reason to live. And like any good Shakespearean tragedy, the death of Setsuko, like the death of Romeo, spelled the death of the other. A double suicide. Nosaka himself said this was the idealized fantasy of his reality. He wished he could have died like Seita after the death of his sister, so cruel was his suffering. But reality is not often so Shakespearean. I, for one, am glad that he lived to write his story, to share what it means to live on the extremities of a society at war, to share what we all know to be true, but most have never experienced, that war is tragic, and that we're all losers in the end.